Okay. Samantha, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today at MCAC Virtual.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's great to join you.
So you are, of course, the Senior Manager of Global Meetings and Events for Baker McKenzie. You're based in Australia, but you oversee the Asia Pacific region. What have the last 18 months been like for you?
Well, it's $1 million question, isn't it? It's been very up and down, I think, and I can probably speak for a lot of people in the industry. First and foremost, I feel very fortunate to still be employed in this industry. And, I think we've all been directly affected by colleagues and friends who have been furloughed and haven't fared as well. So I think that has been a very sobering time. But I also think it has created opportunities. I think in terms of there's a feeling of solidarity amongst industry professionals, because I think this is one of the industries that has been hit very hard by this pandemic, and I think it's created a sense of belonging, and I think everyone feels like they're in this together. It's been very tough, but we are a resilient community. I think we've been very agile in how we've reacted and accommodated to this new world that really none of us expected to be in. I think it's created opportunities, certainly in the virtual space. I would never have thought we'd be doing the volume of virtual events that we have seen, certainly in this firm, for the last 18 months. But it's really made us and forced us to embrace the virtual world, which I don't think we were really comfortable doing beforehand. It's certainly been a learning experience, and it has been, a very rewarding experience in some ways, and obviously, as I say, a sort of very sobering experience in other ways.
So you've mentioned virtual. Of course, we've had to rely on online gatherings and meetings these last 18 months. Seemingly across the world, in-person events are coming back. At the moment, that's largely in the US and Europe. We have pockets of opportunity here in Asia. In Australia, I've seen some in-person events coming back. We have hybrid pilot events happening here in Singapore. But is Baker McKenzie organising any in-person events right now?
At the moment, we've done a few hybrid events, but really in terms of anything large scale in person, the answer is no. And we don't really foresee doing anything for the rest of this calendar year in person on a large scale. As you say, in internal markets, I think that we're starting to see things pick up, but it's just been so unpredictable. I think it's still very volatile. Certainly in Australia, we were in a really good place. And then just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen Melbourne hit another lockdown. We've now currently got Sydney, Perth, Darwin in lockdown. And I think we can plan and we can anticipate, but ultimately we currently are in the hands of these border controls, these travel bubbles that pop up and then unfortunately close. So I think in person is still for us at the moment, just not for this year.
Yeah. I think as an industry, we've always been very risk averse. And now with these uncertainties lingering over snap lockdowns, I think that is really just holding a lot of corporate planners back at the moment.
Yeah, it's just, again, it's that unpredictability. And we can look at hybrid, and we did some hybrid events just last week. We spent around 3 months planning those across 4 cities in Asia Pacific, Taipei, Hong Kong, Sydney and Singapore. And when we started the planning, things were looking quite optimistic, and it seemed like quite a viable project. And by the time the event actually took place last week, we had to pull Taipei and Singapore. So those were entirely virtual audiences, and things were looking good for Hong Kong and Sydney. And then on the last day of the event, the Sydney restrictions came into force. So we did have to cut short the Sydney element for those attending in person. So again, we're trying, we're putting our toes in the water, and I think we're sort of being brave, trying things out. And to some extent, there have been successes, but I think it's still a little way off yet for anything large scale and regional in scope.
And when we look at these new hybrid formats, what is your take? I mean, you just mentioned it took months of planning, and then at the 11th hour, all of these swift changes had to be made. 2 cities pulled.
Yeah.
What was all that like?
Stressful. And it's just so time consuming. I think people who know hybrid events know that this is entirely understandable. They're pretty expensive, and in terms of time and resourcing, that's where we're feeling the hybrid pinch, because it's essentially like organising multiple events for one single event. And you've got the in-person element, plus you've got the virtual. So when you combine all of that, it really is a big exercise. And as you say, when you then have to pull out certain cities, I really query whether the return on the investment is there for hybrid. I'm hoping that the more we do, the easier it gets. But I just think we need to think about the audience and the experience that they have. And I really question, even with a great moderator, is the virtual attendee receiving the same experience as the in-person attendee? And I honestly think that they don't. So I think it is a very different experience for them. I think we do try and coach our lead presenters on making sure that they integrate everybody and they don't forget they have that virtual element. But I think just by the very nature of an event, it is easy to just focus on those in the room. So I think the time and investment that's involved with these hybrid events is so great. I'm just not sure that the return on investment is really there.
It definitely resonates with my experience. I've been lucky enough to moderate panels at hybrid events, and it's really challenging because of course you focus on the people who are in front of you. You can't see your virtual audience in many cases, and so while you're on stage interacting with people in front of you and in the audience, you've also got two different devices usually that you're trying to monitor to see if any questions are coming through from the virtual audience, and it's really tricky to get that engagement, which I think is so key. Knowledge exchange, I feel, can happen virtually and quite successfully. But we all know that when we're attending in-person events and meetings, it's those moments of serendipity, running into someone in the room over lunch and having that networking, that connection. We haven't been able to do that in the virtual space, and we haven't been able to connect the offline and online world, I feel, right now.
I agree. And I think that's what people find rewarding. And I agree with you, knowledge exchange is definitely successful in the virtual format, but it is those impromptu chats, the networking, the creating or maintaining of those connections that you have, and just seeing old familiar faces and having those chats. And I think that's absolutely what's missing. And I think virtual has obviously kept the world turning over the last 12 to 18 months. It's kept industry professionals in business, which of course we're thankful for. It's kept those business wheels turning. But I think in-person events are so valuable just from that human connection perspective. And virtual definitely has a place, I believe, in the future. And I think we've proved it works. And obviously there are advantages when it comes to cost and having larger audiences. The sustainable piece obviously works well from the virtual side, but having that connection with people is what people are missing. So I think in the future, there will be a place for virtual events, and equally there'll be a place for those in-person events where you do need to have that, one-on-one, face-to-face contact.
And speaking of future events or future trends, what would you say are some of the biggest changes to meetings, negotiation and procurement in the wake of COVID-19?
I think there's a few headaches, if I'm honest, at this stage that I'm not sure anyone has real clarity on. But I believe that, it comes back again to clear communication. I think when working with hotels and suppliers, we need to have clear communication in order to manage expectations from the outset, because I think we're dealing with a very different world now. And I think there has to be a degree of compromise. There always has been, but I think it's probably even more essential now, because we have to have, fairness across the board. We are going into these in-person events a little bit nervous, obviously around cancellations and force majeure, but we need to make sure that it's fair for the hotel just as equally as it is for the client. I think the concern for me is around how pricing will work. We fully anticipate that physical distancing will be in place for a while now. So of course those room capacities have come down. How will hotels generate enough revenue to cover their costs if they're looking at 30 to 40% smaller audiences or more? And on top of that, how will hotels manage any COVID outbreaks? I think that's a really big question. And again, I'm not sure that anyone knows the answers just yet, but from a hotel's perspective, how will they manage any breakouts within groups, perhaps not even associated with your own group? What's the knock-on effect to those groups, to event organizers? The costs involved, the logistics and planning around any kind of outbreak. There are some hotel chains that are really ahead of the game there. And I think, for people like me, it's very reassuring to know that there are elements of insurance that these hotels can offer that will cover things like additional accommodation and medical expenses, and at no additional cost to the client, which is an amazing thing to be able to offer. And of course, it gives people like me great peace of mind.
Absolutely, it provides that confidence to return to meetings that we're all craving for. Clearly, you're looking. I mean, when you are booking future in-person meetings, you really want a partner. You don't just want a supplier.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, Lauren, that's where the communication comes back into it. And coming back to our original discussion around how things have been over the last 18 months, those connections that we have in the industry are even more important now than ever before, because as you say, it's a partnership. It's not just a business transaction. And I think that's what we found over the last 12 or so months, that people have been calling in to check on how you are, not to see where the next piece of business is coming from, but a genuine concern about how you are, how's your welfare, are you still employed, how's the family? And I think that now translates into this world where we're hopefully coming back into this in-person industry, where those relationships that have been really solidified over the last few months will really come into play as we work together to, as I say, compromise on these contracts to make sure it's a really good and fair outcome for everybody.
Absolutely. So if there's a silver lining in all of this, it's that we have very authentic relationships with all of our partners and stakeholders now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's great to be able to have a silver lining in this doom and gloom pandemic. I do really believe that has been a real positive of this. I think those genuine conversations, the fact that you can sit at home with perhaps the kids in the background and the dogs barking and not feel terrified by that, or not feel professional, it's real. We're all in this together, and it's very relatable. So I think not being perfect, not being polished is actually refreshing, and it's real. And I think that's been, again, a really good thing to have come out of this.
Agreed. Just finally, Samantha, I know you said that Baker McKenzie isn't organising any in-person meetings right now, but when you do, looking forward, what do you think these in-person meetings will look like? Will they be different?
I think, as I said, I think there's definitely a place for in-person meetings. I think the advantage, if you want to call it that, of the last few months has been that we've seen that the virtual events are successful. So I think there's going to be, a moment of reflection to bring in-person events back, but maybe not to the extent that we saw previously, and maybe the volume of in-person events will be less. But that may bring opportunities for perhaps bigger budgets for those that do go face to face. So I think people will be looking for things to be memorable. I think, to be honest, if people actually get back to in person, that will be a novelty in itself. So I think we're off to a good start anyway. But I think, having those really good communications with the suppliers around what we really want to deliver in terms of the messaging, looking at what the audience is, who they are made up of, and what we want to achieve, I think we'll have to have conversations around that to really deliver these excellent events that are targeted at these audiences. But I think having perhaps bigger budgets will help. But I think just having the clarity around what this event will look like, it's going to be important for everybody, to event organisers to know what to expect, and also to be able to communicate that to the audience, because we may have very different seating plans because of physical distancing. The food and beverage space might be very different, particularly for larger audiences that are used to phase. I think, perhaps those are off the menu, if you like, for a while. So how the food and beverage space will look, and obviously we'll need to focus on the quality and the service of things like food and beverage. But I think it's just, again, all about communication and making sure that everybody's clear on what is going to be delivered.
Agreed. And I think that is a wonderful point to end on. We know events will be back. As human beings, we crave that in-person connection, but clearly the industry has changed forever in the wake of COVID, and there are some silver linings. We have fostered these wonderful relationships, and moving forward, I think they will really help us, create fruitful business exchange. So, Samantha, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Really, really enjoyed chatting with you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great to join you. Thanks very much.